What's your best true spooky story? Serious? My wife and I were having a great weekend in Las Vegas when my father-in-law passed away in the early morning hours. We get the call and haul to get back to the rest of the family. After a couple of hours, the family is all together and talking, sharing memories when we arrive. Shortly after we arrive, it gets brought up, how are we going to share this news with our niece, who was in prison at the time? While trying to figure it out, a call comes from out of nowhere. It's our niece, and she asks what happened to Grandpa. She had a dream that he would visit her and say goodbye. She freaks and calls us. Weird. When my grandparents bought their house for a family of 10, my grandpa found a fake wall upstairs. He tore it down to make more room for the family. Behind the wall were children's clothes and play toys, almost like they walked off the room in a hurry. My mom told me stories of sitting in her room and something circling the walls around her, sounding like wallpaper being torn. When she moved out, my aunt moved into the same room. She would wake up with pictures she hung up laying on her chest in the morning. My cousins also have stories of hearing footsteps coming up the stairs and stopping outside their door in the middle of the night. I still don't go upstairs at their house because it's always cold and I get weird vibes up there. Even in my adult life, I have scary dreams that take place upstairs. I was 7 years old when my family had moved to a neighborhood in a more rural area. My backyard backed up to a farm. My brother was 10, and we were exploring our new street the day after we moved in. It was early spring, mid-afternoon, and all of a sudden we see someone in full traditional riding gear riding a giant horse up our empty street. Not galloping, just a casual stroll. When they went past us, can't remember if it was a person, they didn't look at us and silently continued by. Not unrealistic that someone would be doing that, since I grew up in an area with lots of horse farms. But the farm behind our house was not an active horse farm. They had like one cow and grew corn mostly, and they were coming from the direction where the road dead ends into the woods. My brother and I decided that it was definitely a ghost. I went to use the bathroom at work, and when I entered, there was no one in there. The bathroom has 4 urinals and 4 stalls, 1 handicap, and I did not see any feet in any of the stalls. I took up my normal spot inside one stall and was doing my business when I heard the sound of someone peeing into one of the urinals. But no one had entered the bathroom. The door is heavy and loud when it closes, so I would have heard someone entering. After a normal amount of time, the peeing stopped, and I heard a few footsteps. But the door never opened. When I finished, I had a cursory look and there was no one in the bathroom. It's a ridiculous story, but I definitely heard a pee ghost. At the time I was around 14, I'd asked my dad to wake me up early that morning at about 5 a.m. because I had some work to get done. That morning, I was woken up, and I flung my legs over the side of my bed. I felt a tug on both of them. What I thought at the time was just my dad trying to get me to hurry up. I reached over to pick up my phone and turned it on, 3:30 a.m., and I looked over at the black figure I assumed was my dad, and it was gone. I was about 11 and I saw my dad standing in my doorway staring at me at like 4 a.m. I was so confused because he almost looked mad. So, I called out to him. No response. I blinked and he was closer. I blinked again, he was at the foot of my bed. I pulled my covers over my head and started screaming. Also, I don't know why, but doppelganger dad had boxers with flamingos on them, and when my parents came running to my room, he had on his Flintstone pajama pants. I asked, and apparently he does not in fact own flamingo boxers. This just happened to me 2 days ago. I was walking into the house after work around 6 p.m., so it was already mostly dark, and suddenly the entire sky lit up bright green, and there was a super loud zap sound just like a movie laser or something, right over my head, so loud that I hit the deck and then tore back into the house. One of my roommates was cooking dinner and I was like, "What is it? Did you see that?" But he didn't. We went back outside, no transformers near or out, no house's electricity out, no sign of disturbance at all. Now I'm a rational grown man, a believer in science and always that there must be a rational explanation for this sky, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. I was in high school, my uncle would throw me a couple bucks to help babysit his kids with my aunt. They lived in a 2-story house by the water, a nice area. The kids were about 3 and 6. One day I was sitting in their den on my phone when I started to hear a baby crying. Thinking it was the 3-year-old, I headed to the bottom of the stairs to check and see if my aunt was up there dealing with it. I called her a couple times with no response. The baby kept crying. I called for her one more time, and when I got no response I started walking up the stairs. Then I heard my cousins and aunt playing outside. All the hairs on my body stood up and I literally felt a chill run down my spine. I quietly turned around, walked down the stairs, got in my car, and drove away. The baby was still crying when I closed the door behind me. A few years later I was drunk at a family party and told my uncle the story. He told me that he and his wife used to hear the baby too, and apparently the previous owners had a kid die of SIDS in that room upstairs. He's uber Catholic and had a mass said for the baby. He said after that it never happened again. Still gives me the willies when I talk about it though. I have a bunch, but I think the best one I have actually happened to my mom. We lived in a very creepy old house when I was little. One day my mom was cleaning my little brother's room while we were at school and every single one of his electronic toys turned on all at once. 2 of them did not have batteries in them. She was so freaked out she had us camp out in the living room for 3 days because she didn't want my brother alone in his room. Up until we moved, that would occasionally happen. Either 1 or 2 toys at a time. I tell this story a lot and no one ever believes me, but I know what I saw. I stayed at my grandparents' for the summer when I was 14. It was 11 p.m. and I was thirsty to go out to the kitchen and see who I thought was my granddad sitting at the table eating a sandwich. I say hello, grab a glass of water and head back to my room. My grandfather comes out of his room and asks who I was talking to. I turned around and no one was there. It freaked me out, still does to this day. About 2 months after my father passed, my mom and all of my siblings were sitting around the dining room table. We were just talking about the past and sharing stories. We were talking about my father and suddenly the globe around the light on the ceiling fell straight down on the center of the table. It didn't break or roll or move at all after hitting the table. Scared all of us. My father passed away almost 11 years ago, but I've seen him 3 times since. The first time was in middle school. I was working on a family tree project and was asking my mother about his side of the family. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him walk out of the room he died in, heading towards his favorite spot on the couch. The second time was a year or 2 later. I'd had an awful day, one of the worst in memory, and as I was walking across the hall to the bathroom I caught a glimpse of him sitting in his old spot at the table, reading a newspaper. The last time was the clearest. My senior year of high school. My mother and I were sitting at that same table, talking about college plans. I mentioned I was applying to the rival school of my father's alma mater. Just then, I saw him walk, again from the room he died in, over to the counter, where he grabbed a coffee cup and walked towards his bedroom. I guess they just like to check up with us every now and then. I currently live in a haunted house. I've heard voices, footsteps, lights have been turned on off, one of the ghosts has a thing for silverware, I hear it clattering in the drawer all the time, and sometimes a knife or 2 will end up in the wrong slot in the drawer. But the strangest/scariest experience I had was the first night I spent in the house. I wasn't finished moving in, there were boxes everywhere, I didn't even have my mattress up there yet. I was bedding on an old futon mattress, watching a video on my phone, when I get the pins and needles feeling of my feet falling asleep. Except it wasn't on my feet, it was on the top of my head in the shape of a hand. I said, "Good night," turned off my light and tried to sleep. When I woke up my closet door was ajar, but other than that everything was otherwise untouched. I guess whoever my unseen roommate is, just wanted to check out who I was on my first night. Me and friend of mine live in rural Ireland, we were going for a walk in the grounds behind a castle. As we were coming to the end of our walk, it was pretty dark, and we glanced into an area that had a well and something caught our eye. He stayed a bit further back, walked over and looked into the well only to see 2 yellow eyes looking up at me and a sinister looking grin from a girl with dark hair. Naturally we ran like little girls. We were followed by this little girl all night. We went to graveyard and found her watching us while she sat on a tree. We went under a bridge a few miles outside of the village and she was standing at the other end of the bridge, and slowly started walking toward us. We both saw her every single time. Explanation is easy, we dropped a load of LSD and were hallucinating. Just fascinating that we both saw the exact same thing. I never told him what I saw in the well until he told me what he had seen. It matched. Just yesterday I was in my cousin's house after helping them with the laundry and heard someone say hello, and it is anyone here, low tone. And the family was in their parents' room, and I was in their room. I was like hush and decided must be the TV that was on in their room, and if anything, they would have heard it too. Dogs started barking a little bit. Then after like 10 minutes I stopped paying attention because no one was screaming there was an intruder in the house. My cousin comes back to their room and asks me why the front door is open. My mom just last week told me a story about when I was a kid. I had to be 4 or 5. We went to visit my grandmother's grave estate over. My mother and I lived with her and my grandfather until I were 3 and my grandmother died. My mom said my grandma and I were super close. We traveled from Indiana to Illinois and visited her grave, out in the middle of nowhere off of a gravel road with a forest just past the cemetery. My mom said I jumped up after visiting her gravesite and started to run to the trees. My mom was only 21 to 22 at the time, so she could keep up with me and asked me where I was going, and I said I'm going to play with Mama. Look, there's Mama. She then said she scooped me up and took me to the car kicking and screaming because I couldn't understand why I couldn't play with my grandma. Then she told me that right after my grandma died when I was 3 that I would lay in bed and talk to her. Weird. Grandpa was in police and tragically expired in my arms when he fell from the stairs. He was proud that I had joined the government services as well, and the quote "behave like an officer" was something like an inside joke between the two of us. A few years later I'm in my car and it's freezing outside. There was a police check and I saw the police officer who was inspecting the cars wasn't wearing any jacket. Immediately made me think of Grandpa, with all the police officers around in their uniforms and all. My turn comes and I roll down my window and gently remind the officer to put on his jacket. He looks in my eyes and smiles and says, "Now that's spoken like an officer," and tells me to go. He said it in exactly his voice, his style. It had been years since I resigned from the services and there was no way this police officer could have guessed I had been an officer. When I was about 10, 4 of our cousins lived with us, and I had 2 siblings, so that means there were 7 of us. We were in the family room, sitting in a circle playing a game. My parents were out doing whatever adult errands they had that day. We all heard a voice call out Zachary. It was the voice of our grandmother, and one of my cousins was named Zach. No one heard my parents come home and they didn't mention they would be getting our grandma, so we all ran out of the room to greet her. We quickly realized my parents were not home, and our grandmother wasn't there either. We even went outside to check and there was no one in our neighbors' yards either. We were baffled. It was one of many paranormal instances in that house, but this one was experienced by 7 people. One time I wanted a Coke and when I went into the kitchen there was a knife balancing on its tip, next to a full can of Coke. When I was home alone. Edit, holy crud, this has gotten a lot of attention. To answer a few questions, yes, I drank soda. To the skeptics who say I'm lying, this happened. If you don't believe it, give me a rational explanation as to how a soda can get from a refrigerator to the kitchen counter, along with a knife standing on its tip, which might be impossible. Provide me with a rational explanation as to how that happened in a locked house. I got lost in the woods in North Carolina during a game of paintball. It was broad daylight, but the woods were really thick, and every tree looked exactly the same. It probably only lasted 1 to 2 minutes, but it felt like I was screaming help 4 hours. The worst part? Turns out I wasn't even lost. I was maybe 10 feet from everyone else, and they all heard me screaming help, but they thought I was acting as a decoy. Like what, the actual thing? Who hears someone crying for help and ignores them? Jesus, Dad. When I was a kid, we'd be out at dusk helping my parents in the garden and they'd freeze like they just saw something terrifying and say, "Grab your brother and run to the house right now and lock the door behind you." So, my poor older sister and I would scoop up our kid brother, book it to the house in pure silent fear, and huddle together by the window so we could peep out. Every time they'd come in from the field, doubled over laughing. I know they thought it was funny because we bought it every time, but Jesus Christ, Mom and Dad, you want a couple kids with anxiety issues, you're doing it right. I had a recurring scary dream. In it, I was at my grandparents' farmhouse, which is over 200 years old. I was dressed in Victorian clothes and in the fields and walking down a strange path, but it felt like I had been there many, many times. I walked through the woods and eventually came to a cabin. It felt eerie, like a presence of death. I opened the door and there was death all around me. The cries of children filled the air. I had this dream for months. I eventually ended up visiting my grandparents on spring break or something and decided to follow my dream's path. I ended up in a cabin. It looked exactly like in my dream. I was terrified. I called my friend to try to shake my fear and cautiously opened the door. There was a burned car seat and burned children's toys scattered around the ground. I felt an awful sense of dread and backed up slowly while trying to catch my breath. I've since tried to look after missing children in the area and have found nothing. I have no idea what it all means, but as soon as I found that cabin, the dream stopped. The house I grew up in was fairly old and my dad did some serious renovations to it. I always got the creeps from the attic, which was a full third story, and eventually my dad fixed it up as a kind of 2-bedroom apartment for me and my older brother. One night when I was maybe 13, while everyone else was asleep, I heard 3 loud bangs on the wall outside of my room, right next to my head. Important note, the stairs were on the other side of the wall in a traditional Victorian style, some steps, then a landing, 180-degree pivot, more steps, so the point on the wall where the bangs were coming from was about 8 feet off the ground. Directly after the bangs, the touch lamp next to my bed started going crazy. It had 4 settings, off, dim, bright, brightest, and it cycled through them without being touched for about 30 seconds while out in the big, open living area, our stereo turned on at full volume blaring punk album I had just discovered. I quickly ran out of my room and turned the stereo off, not wanting to wake anyone else in my family, and then just kind of sat in my room with a light on until I could fall back asleep. This was probably the creepiest experience I ever had in the house, but definitely not the only one. Exploring a historic abandoned apartment complex, pretty rough shape due to a pretty large fire. I had an extremely uneasy feeling the entire time, which was strange considering this is just a normal day exploring. But eventually we decided it was time to leave, but at the last second we found the basement, so we hopped down there to take a peek. As soon as we enter the basement from the staircase, we hear extremely loud and slow walking boots on the first floor right above our heads. It sounded like one person, alone, with very heavy boots. It did not sound like he was in a hurry. We were absolutely petrified. We could hear each other's heartbeats from across the doorway. The weird thing was, we were right next to the entrance, so there was absolutely no way somebody had wandered through while we were walking out. We waited about a minute to hear this thing walk back and forth above us. As soon as the boots stopped, we found a basement window that was cracked open and hopped out. Didn't see anybody from the outside, no person in sight. Creepiest story I have from years of exploring. Not my experience, but my dad's. He is a nurse, so he has told me some pretty scary stories. Probably one of the scariest was when this one guy was dying from liver failure, because he was drunk his entire life. So, there wasn't anything anybody could do except wait. Now, this guy was a hardcore atheist, according to my dad, and was not shy in making it known. So, when the guy began to pass away, suddenly he gripped the sides of the bed really tight, and his eyes got really wide, like, oh shit, kind of wide, and he started yelling, "Don't let them take me," over and over again. My dad said even after he was dead they had a hard time getting his hands to unclutch the sides of the bed. It was almost 1 a.m, and a strange man with a white t-shirt knocks on my door asking for help. After quick deliberation where my father went outside to talk to the man, he told me to lock the doors and get the kids into the room. Upon closer inspection, the man had a faint smear of blood on the t-shirt. When I asked him if he needed aid for the suspected wound, he told me that it wasn't his blood. 5 minutes later, my mom called the cops. 10 minutes later, when the cops came, it was an entire squad. I didn't get to see the action because I was inside of a bedroom huddling the kids in a circle while cop lights flashed brightly through the window. I heard screaming from the cops to tell the man to stop, a barking canine, and a loud boom, but it was most likely the taser. Afterwards, more cops came to clean the blood off our walkway, and because the man came to our house, we had the right to obtain an explanation. The man is a wanted serial killer from Georgia. I live in Texas. I personally have quite a few spooky stories, but my mom has a good one, so I will tell hers. When she was younger, her and a group of friends were driving down a desolate road at night, and there was a house that they passed that had a window lit up upstairs, so they slowed down to look, and she said there was a lantern in the window and a man and a woman sat facing each other. She then said that a second man wearing a top hat came into view, walked up behind the woman, and started strangling her. At this point my mom and her friends freaked out and drove off. When they went back to see what had happened, they drove up to where they had seen it happen, and it wasn't even a window they had seen, it was a plastic sheet, so they didn't know what to make of it, but they all ended up agreeing they had seen a ghost. When I was 12, my brother was born to my dad and stepmom. We were in the middle of moving to our new house, which was built in the 1890s. My dad had done a lot of remodeling work on it and had uncovered old baby toys in a pantry that was sealed up under the staircase. We had finished moving in and getting settled when we had strange things happening. The rocking chair in my brother's nursery would sometimes be moving when you went into the room. We could hear my brother as he got older. We could hear him babble at people who weren't there, and often if you went and got him up from his crib, he would smell heavily of older women's perfume. When we looked into it, we found the house had been owned in the 50s by a couple who couldn't have kids, and the wife died in the house. After my brother turned 2, it stopped happening. My stepmom swore that it was the lady who couldn't have children, and we helped her come to peace. My family members tell this story about me, that I have no memory of, or I had woken them up around 2 a.m. one morning because I was screaming for someone to come and save me. My parents had rushed out of bed and run into the kitchen where I was standing, and my sister shortly followed after them. They said I was holding a knife, trembling, and screaming for someone to save me as I was pointing it at my room across from the house. My eyes had never been so wide, and I seemed to be completely awake, but couldn't hear anyone. This had gone on for nearly 20 minutes with my family screaming at me, too scared to come near me, until I had dropped the knife, put my arms to the side, and walked to my room still wide-eyed and fell asleep. This scared my entire family, and when I woke up the next morning to hear about it, I had no idea anything had even happened. I guess I just sleepwalk sometimes. My wife and I, at the time girlfriend, had one of the scariest moments of our lives that, to this day, haunts me. We were in my car ready to leave, and we heard a strong clicking noise. It was coming from her side, and I thought her knee was holding the lock button. It was a rapid clicking and didn't stop. The longer it went on, the more I realized it was the door handle being pulled up. Then the car started to shake as if someone were pulling the door handle up as hard as they could. We both looked at each other and told each other to cut it out. Finally, it stops. I go outside and look around and under the car. Nothing. We of course looked around as if it was happening and saw nothing. What scares me the most is that we were in a well-lit area. Right under the street lamp. We could see clearly all around us. My wife hates when I bring this story up, and when she saw me writing this she got mad. Was in my college house alone in the evening. All roommates were back home with family out of state. I took a shower, and when I opened the bathroom boot afterwards, the ottoman from the chair in the living room on the other side of the house was in front of the door. As I'm walking back to the living room, I notice all the coats that had been hung up on the hooks in the front hall are gone, and there are tennis rackets hung up in their place. The tennis rackets had been there in the front hall closet, so I looked in the closet and all the coats are hung on hangers, including my own, which I had put on the hook not an hour ago, and I never hung my coat in the closet. This just happened on Thanksgiving this year. We have 2 kids, and the 5-month-old sleeps in our room. My wife went out Black Friday shopping, so I stayed home with the kids. About 12 a.m., the 5-month-old wakes up screaming. I comfort him and I'm walking back and forth in our pitch black room when all of a sudden I feel a rush of air and see what I believe is my 2-year-old standing there. It wasn't him. It was what I can describe as a white light/mist shaped like my son standing there. When I blinked, it was gone. Actually, when I saw it I gasped for air and all the hair on my body stood on end. Put my son back to sleep and was sort of confused/scared the rest of the night. Ever since that night, stuff has been happening. Toys are constantly turning on when I'm near them, lights are switching on/off when we aren't in rooms, and I can feel a presence in my bedroom. It's tough to describe. I haven't seen it since, but I can always feel it there. It seems to be attached/focused on my son. One night my wife and I were talking about laying some pipe when all of a sudden a vibrator in her drawer went on full throttle. House was built in the 40s and I have no history on it. I had a weird episode of sleepwalking where I woke up out by the school I was going to at the time. Naked. In the middle of fall. Only, I wasn't quite awake, it was like my eyes were stuck shut. Everything was weird and red and wobbly, kind of like the final boss from Earthbound. It still looked like my town, but it was just completely wrong. Red and black everywhere, nobody out on the street, all the lights off. And I felt something on the back of my neck. I walked back to my house and tried waking up my dad, seeing if he could help. Then, I actually woke up. By his bed. And my feet were dirty. I'd never told my parents about this because I was too freaked out by it. I don't remember sleepwalking to the school, only half lucidly walking back. It was not a fun time. Camping in Yellowstone can be an enriching experience, and I recommend it to everyone. My family was on night 3 of a 5-day/4-night hike around Shoshone Lake. We had an easy day, but with a long hike on day 4, we all went to bed early, 9-ish. About 10:30, several of us are still awake due to the noise. If you have ever dropped a basketball in an empty gym, you have heard this sound. The forest was dead silent as this thumping went on. It came in round of a loud start and tapered off to soft thumps. After a minute or two it would start again. We all whispered to each other about hearing it just to make sure we weren't all going insane. My sister suggested it was a killer wild man waiting for us to come out. A theory not diminished by being spooked by another hiker 2 days later. Turns out, my family heard the mating call of a forest grouse. They only call on cloudless nights under the moon and do so by beating their wings on a fallen tree or hollow log. Simplest explication, but spookiest sound to hear that want to growl or howl in the woods. My father was in the hospital, dying of cancer. My immediate family was there in the room with him, except for my 3-year-old nephew. One of our friends from church had taken him to an empty room down the hall to try and get him to go to sleep in one of the empty beds. My father passed away around 2 a.m. that morning, and at that exact time, the friend told us that my nephew sat straight up in bed all of a sudden and said clearly, "Bye, Grandpa." So, my dad wanted to say goodbye to his only grandchild before he left. Was riding some trails with my friend and my brother a week or so after a controlled burn. So, it was a big empty field at the time. Saw a man in the distance in a red sweater shouting a name. We thought he was looking for his dog. We decided to go and help him. We rode past a small portion of wooded area that was still left and lost sight of him for about 30 seconds but could still hear him calling the name. Once we got into the clearing again, he was nowhere to be seen. Keep in mind there is no way he could have run into the wooded area. She was at least 200 yards from it. We stopped and looked at each other, and before we could say anything the bright blue sunny sky turned black, and it started to thunder badly with furious winds. We hauled home, and it was sunny by the house about 3 miles away. Crazy. This will probably get buried, but here goes. Back in the 90s I was in the living room playing a game on the computer. My dad came in and talked to me for about a minute, then went back to his room to go to bed. I went back to playing the game. A few minutes later I get this feeling that something is looking at me. I looked up and in the same spot where my dad was standing was a form in the shape of my dad. I could see through it. It looked like iridescent smoke. I was startled and it immediately disappeared. A long time ago when I was just starting kindergarten I would ride the afternoon bus home. For the first few weeks I would see my grandpa on the side of the road by the entrance of my neighborhood. When I got home I told my mom all about it. How he just stood there and waved at me. All I would get was perplexed looks. The reason for this is that my grandfather committed suicide 2 weeks before school started. What I didn't find out until recently was that he had died right by the pond that was a few feet from the road. I was visiting my single aunt who lived completely alone. She didn't even own a pet. I had fallen asleep on the couch in the dark with the remote in my hand. In the middle of the night, I cracked my eyes open to see a figure hunched over the TV. At that moment, they manually switched the TV off. Confused, and with the remote still in my hand, I quickly turned it back on. The person sighed and switched it off again. I protested with "Hey." And this deep, angry male voice hisses back at me to "Shut up, bitch." I froze completely solid in the darkness and heard them shuffle off. I reluctantly stood up and bolted to my aunt's bedroom to explain everything. She got her gun, and we looked all over the house. The bolt locks on the front and back door were still latched from the inside with no sign of anyone coming into the house at all, and most importantly, there was like 2 feet of undisturbed snow surrounding the perimeter of her home. She told me it was likely a dream, but I am absolutely positive it wasn't. That man's voice still haunts me. A good few years back when I still lived with my parents, the house we were in had 3 bedrooms directly at the top of the closed staircase, meaning we couldn't see into the living room or anything. One night, whilst everyone else is sleeping and I am online talking to friends and blasting music through my headphones, an almighty crash sounds from downstairs, making me jump up in fright and causing everyone else to dash straight out of bed. Me and my dad go down to see if someone has broken in or smashed a window only to find nothing broken, moved, or disturbed in any way. We never found any reason for the noise. In college I slept on an air mattress with my Dalmatian asleep at my feet. One night at about 3:30 a.m. something sat down on the corner of my mattress behind my head waking me up. I could feel it settle down and just sit, not moving at all. That's the part that freaked me out the most. If it had been a critter, it either wouldn't have come in because of my dog or would have kept moving. I laid there pretending to sleep and got this horrible feeling that if I tried to look at it and see what it was, terrible things would happen. I don't know how long it stayed because I eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, I went through my room looking for signs of an animal and made the property owner bring out an exterminator to find any holes in the walls or floors. Nope, nothing there. It was to this day the freakiest thing I have ever experienced. A couple of weeks ago, I was on a Postmates run with a friend. He's a driver. We got to this apartment complex and saw a lady come downstairs with her dog, a cute little thing. I waved to him and her just kind of gives me a blank stare. Okay, rude, whatever. We go up to the 2nd floor via the only elevator in the whole complex and deliver the package, and as we're turning back down the hallway we came, we see the same lady and dog come walking towards us. That's weird, we just saw her downstairs a couple of seconds ago. There's either a second elevator in this building, there wasn't, we checked, or she really hauled upstairs while we were going up via the real elevator. She turns left and disappears. We assume she just went down a second stairway that we didn't see coming up the first time and followed her since we needed to get down anyways and didn't want to take the elevator. Nope, she turned left into a dead-end brick wall. She and the dog are nowhere to be found, not on the street outside or in the alley behind the building. What? We scoured the whole building and found out that there's only one stairway, on the opposite side of the building, and only one elevator, the one that we used. So how did she get up there so quickly, and how did she get down without passing us if she didn't take the elevator and we clearly saw her turn left into a brick wall? Ghosts. That's how. I was visiting my parents while I was in college one summer. I was taking a nap around 11 a.m. on the couch in their living room with the TV on when I was woken up by a doorknob jiggling hard upstairs. Their doors have those knobs that lock by pushing in the knob and turning, no buttons or anything on it. I assumed that my dad had locked himself in a room accidentally, as he had done before, to great comedic effect and frustration on his part. So, I go upstairs, and all the doors are wide open. At this point I was a little weirded out, but I decided I was having some weird half-awake imaginary sound thing going on. I go back downstairs and turn the TV off and fall back asleep. About an hour later I'm woken up again by the sound of a doorknob jiggling, except it was on the other side of the house upstairs from the last one. I got up again and all the doors were still wide open. I called my parents at work. They ran an automobile service station at the time, and asked if either of them had been home at all that day, and both said that they were at work all day. Needless to say, I got out of there. It hasn't happened since, and that was about 6 years ago. Also related, a friend and I were helping my parents move into that house and moving a bunch of stuff into a room above the attached garage. It was a small room that could be a bedroom/study/ etc., but because the AC and heat didn't work very well in there, they decided to use it as storage. There was a small closet attached to the room, and when my friend and I were moving things into there, we noticed that there was a bookcase sitting in there with a note saying that we could keep it. That's when we noticed that there was the top of a doorway behind the bookcase. Again, super creeped out. Eventually we got around to checking that door out and it just led to the attic, and nothing was in there, but at the time it was super creepy and weird. Early sophomore year, in college, my girlfriend spends the night in my dorm room. She'd lost her virginity to me the night before, and this was her first time ever spending the night in a boy's bed. That morning, she was still half asleep, so I got into the shower. While showering, I'm 100% certain I can hear someone calling out my name. But hey, I ignored it. There's that thing where you end up hearing your own name in white noise just because it's something you're so attuned to hear. The weird thing was it sounded very loud, like it was being shouted, but also far away, but also like the sound was coming from deep inside my own head. Like I was wearing headphones and hearing my own name called out in this tiny, panic scream. It was really odd, but again I dismissed it entirely. Finished my shower and went about my day, never mentioning it to anyone. 2 years later, we're sitting around in someone's dorm room and my girlfriend casually mentions, "Oh yeah, remember that first night I stayed in your room? And then you went to go to the shower?" I was freaking out because it was so dark in your room, and I started having a panic attack and started screaming your name in my head while you were in the shower. I try not to think about this too much, since I'm very much one of those science uber alles types of guys who likes to mock the new age. But this was the one thing I personally experienced that feels like it was legit supernatural. No ghosts or angels or any of that, just a tiny experience of straight up telepathy, or one really weird heck of a coincidence. This is about 8 years ago when I was still with my ex and her 2 kids, but the household had been plagued for a couple of weeks with intense and bad dreams. We were all sitting around for dinner one night and somebody started talking about how bad their dreams had been and everybody else chimed in about how bad theirs had been too. I'm a pretty lucid dreamer, where I'll realize I'm dreaming, practice flying, or just bail on the dream altogether. Well, a few days pass and one night I'm sleeping, and I have this particularly vivid dream about me fighting a demon. And it's not a fun movie about demon fights, it's pretty intense. So, in my dream, I start reciting this incantation. I don't remember what I was saying or how I knew it, but I remember it being English in the dream. I also realize I'm fighting this demon in a dream, so I will myself speak this incantation aloud in the real world. This wakes up my ex who was sleeping next to me. This wakes up my ex, and she goes, "Armor Phoenix, you're talking in your sleep." And I go, "I know." And she asks, "Why?" To which I respond, "Because spells are more powerful when you say them out loud," right as I roll over and go back to snoring. Freaks her out a little bit. She tells me the next day that the stuff I was speaking didn't sound like gibberish, but it wasn't English. But after that, no more spooky dreams for the household. This is actually really interesting to me, because in Islam, we believe in other beings, sort of like humans in that they are accountable for their actions and have free will, but different in how they have been created, and that we as humans can't see them. We call them jinn, and they're supposed to leave humans alone, but evil jinn are like the devil's minions and will try to cause distress. We believe that bad dreams actually come from Satan or his minions, but that reciting the Quran, God's words, especially specific passages, will keep you safe because evil beings are hurt by it or can't stand it. So, I always recite a specific passage before I go to sleep, and I rarely have bad dreams. Some nights though, I do, and they're seriously creepy in that they're not scary so much as they are off. For me, the scariest one was when I was in a dorm with a couple other girls, and we were all just talking, but I was distracted because I kept getting these bad vibes from one of the girls, so I was avoiding looking at her, and because I kept looking for my glasses. For some reason I finally look at her, and I see she's wearing them. But more than that, she has my face. Except it doesn't look like me to me, and she's giving me this really creepy smile, and I just feel my heart stop. I think I realized at this point that something supernatural was going on, so I started recited that passage of the Quran in my dream, and I just see her face, my face, crumple and she starts to scream horribly, and I wake up breathing really hard. Other creepy dreams I have often end similarly. Anyways, this is a really long comment, but I just thought it was interesting, since you said you were reciting something and didn't know what it was but that it didn't sound like gibberish, tongue sticking out. So, this story is about an uncle of mine. He was a nice man with a loving family. He worked as a Muslim missionary where he traveled the world and talked about Islam, corrected people's misunderstandings, not an extremist, but corrected the extremists themselves, anyway. He loved to travel as well and heard about a village in Malaysia who apparently practice a lot of black magic and curse people using demons. I know it sounds weird, but I wouldn't have trusted the story as well if it wasn't in the family. So, he decided that these people are causing problems for their neighbors, and it would be better to go and talk to them about Islam. He went even after copious efforts for him not to meddle in something like that. However, he was determined to help these people from at least stop cursing others. He went to the village and camped around for 10 days trying to convince people, but it was to no worth. They didn't listen, and they attempted to kill him or sacrifice him for the greater good of the village. So naturally he came back. This all happened roughly 2 months ago. He came back to his normal life, but would feel weird. He started hearing voices, cries, and screams. According to his family, he couldn't be left alone because he would try to fight voices and throw things. His family was very patient with him, but after 1 month exactly, he could hear someone call his name from any corner in the room and eventually hung himself up. I don't know what happened, but we're sure he was cursed badly. Sorry for long post, and I realize it not nearly as scary as the other posts, but I still think it's scary enough to know there are people who will curse you to death. I would like to share a story about the time when I was a monk in Thailand 2 years ago. It is a culture thing where men older than 20 years old would participate in ordination as monk, usually 1 to 3 months, but nowadays, it is only for ceremony's sake and only do it for a week. As for me, I choose to do it to repent and to repay my parents for taking of me. So, I chose 1 month, because I have to go back to the unit afterward. First night as a monk will be the one I will remember to this day. It was a fortunate day and there are 6 participants in the ordination including me. The ceremony went well, and we learned etiquette and mantra in the afternoon. At night, the elder monk who were assigned to help us asked if we are afraid of ghosts. Well, to be fair, none of us have ever seen one and we are in the temple as a monk. What there is to fear, right? Furthermore, there is no cemetery nor crematorium in this temple. Safe, and we are in Bangkok, a big city. Me and 2 other monks were assigned a room with open window on the second of the monastery. Nothing is wrong with it except the ceiling has holes in it, many big holes in the gypsum, and all we saw was the pitch black holes. Well, plus there are many small Buddha statues on the window border, and why did they put them here and not the altar? We all asked the same question. Thai horror film has these kinds of setup a lot. We decided to drop the topic. Fast forward into the night, after evening prayers, we all separated and head back to our room. We pick a mat and start to sleep and conserve our strength since we can't eat afternoon and we have to wake up early to pray and walk in the town asking for food. I have to walk to my house and back to the temple, which is around 6 kilometers, barefoot. So, time to sleep. I picked a middleman and put my head toward the window. The marble floor is very hard to sleep in even with a mat, but I am too tired to protest. I fell asleep for some time. Suddenly I felt a pain in my neck. The cushion was so hard, so I rolled over. Now I am half awake. I can hear the clock ticking, but my eyes remain closed. I hear no breathing sound from my roommate. Silence. Everything is fine. Let's go back to sleep. Suddenly I heard a loud bird crying in this distance. The sound is so hoarse and very unpleasant. It is very loud in the silent night, but you don't know what bird it is. I didn't recognize the sound. Then the dog started howling. There are lots of dog in the temple. The dog howl from the other end of temple, which is the dock, and just like domino, now every dog start to howl like mad. The feeling is heavy, and I am so tired. My eyelid is heavy, because I am afraid of the darkness in the ceiling above my head. Suddenly, the howling end. I open my eyes slowly. There was nothing in the ceiling. Why would I risk it, to be honest? But what follow is the most agonizing thing ever. The wind start blowing, and here come the long wheeze coming from the distance, but the sound come closer and closer. I can hear it so clearly. It isn't a whistle, but a sound of a wind blowing outside of something very small. Wheeze. My eyes remain shut, and the wheezing stopped just on top of my head, outside of the window above me. It continues forever. My body is numbing, and I forgot to breathe until I fell asleep due to exhaustion. I don't know when the sound will stop, but in the norming I shared what I heard with my roommate. The thing is, they were awake last night as well, but they only heard the bird, the dog howl, and they said that they turned to look at me and my body stiffened almost as if I was frozen, but they didn't hear the wheezing sound howling in the night. I asked the elder monk about this, and he said that it could be one of the apparition with big body, big hand, but a very small mouth as small as a needle hole. It is one of the punishment for the sinners who lie a lots, something like that. It probably come to ask some merits, and I should give it and forgive it for frightening me. I also heard the same sound 3 or 4 nights later, but faintly and far away, not outside my window, and I slept peacefully. There is another story that I would like to share if people are interested in. P.S. Sorry for bad English and mistake, I type it from my phone. When I was about 12, I was at my cousin's house, he was about 9, on their trampoline. This was an older neighborhood, kind of dilapidated. My cousin and I got the bright idea to sneak into the old, abandoned house on the other side of his fence. So, we climbed the fence, walked the narrow path between his fence and the side of the old house, we were barefoot, WTF, and go around to the front of the house. The front door was actually modern, a steel door with a lock on it. We tried it, and it opened. We went inside, and the smell hit us like a wall. This sweet, sickly smell filled the whole house, so we held our noses as we walked through. There was no glass on the floor, which was fortunate for our aforementioned bare feet, but there was a lot of dust. It was a shotgun house with maybe 4 small rooms that we could tell, and in the front room there were like 6 or 7 mountain bikes. We figured someone was just storing things here. The bathroom was off this room, and it had a bunch of small, old glass bottles that looked like they dated back to the 1940s, or thereabouts. The second room, past the first, had a bunch of old junk in it, but the thing that sticks out in my mind was an old cassette player with a cassette still in it. On the label the cassette said Deborah, March 18, 1993. We didn't really care about this. The third room had more bikes and more junk, and it had a tiny closet off to the side. We wrestled the cobwebs away and saw nothing other than a chainsaw with red-brown residue on it. Alarm bells were going off in our heads now, and even though we tried to rationalize it as just rust, we decided to quickly see what was in the fourth room and then get out. We walked into the fourth room and saw that it was completely empty, except for some stairs to the basement, lots of dust, and a small wooden cross. Painted on it were these words, Deborah, September 29, 1963, March 18, 1993. Then we heard a thump from the basement. Then we ran. We ran out the front door, down the path, climbed the fence, through my cousin's backyard, into his house, up the stairs, into his room and under the bed. We stayed there for hours, whispering, and speculating and vowing never to go back there again. But we did. And that's another story for another day. You might think this is fictional, and I kinda worded it that way. But I can't make this up. Part 2, I went back to my cousin's house a few days later. It aroused no suspicion from our parents since he lived a few blocks away and played together all the time. I brought my little sister with me to play with my cousin's younger siblings. My sister was 9 just like my cousin, but I wouldn't dream of telling her. She was a huge blab and my cousin, and I had decided that we didn't want anyone to know yet. Especially not the adults. As for my cousin, we'll call him Connor from now on. He didn't know I was coming, but he was glad I did, because he had done some research on the house. He told me that in the first owners, an elderly couple who had built the house around the turn of the century, had moved out and never sold the house. They left it to their son when they died, and their son left it to his son. But nobody had ever lived in it since the first owners moved out, so it had been empty since about 1948, confirming my guess about the age of the glass bottles in the bathroom windowsill. The house had just been used to store things ever since. We had already planned for our second visit. We each brought a flashlight. Both of us had our own pistols, handguns, rifles, etc., but we didn't dare try to sneak them out of the house, so we each brandished our pocket knives, freshly sharpened for the occasion. We skittered along the path between the old house and the back of his fence. It wasn't a path, really. It was a space about 5 to 6 feet wide, covered in twigs and leaves and those awful sticker plants. All of this was brown, which was probably why we didn't see the ball of twine on our last adventure. It was nestled against the side of the old house under a pile of leaves. It was about the size of an adult's fist, and it was brown, as twine usually is. It looked old, and it was rather heavy. I pocketed it and we moved on. We crept around to the front of the house and quickly slipped inside. We didn't want to linger on the off chance that someone might see us. It was, after all, broad daylight. In the house nothing had changed. It was exactly as we had left it. I did pocket the cassette, as one of you was hoping. The bikes were all still there. So were the chainsaw and the old glass bottles. It appeared that nobody had been in or out since we left. No one probably had. It had only been a few days. We went straight to the last room after poking around a bit in the other three and finding nothing of interest. The cross was still there. After standing around a bit, listening for any thumps, we mustered up all the courage we had and decided to go down to the basement. I know what you're thinking, how cliché. But after creeping down the stairs and around the corner, knives brandished and ready, we found nothing. There were a few piles of leaves here and there, an old empty pop can, and other assorted trash. But otherwise, nothing. No sign of anything amiss. So, we went back upstairs, dismissing the thump we heard a few days before as just the house settling, or falling apart, considering how old it was, and left. But instead of going back, we decided to check out the other side of the house. I really wish we hadn't. There was a pair of old storm doors that we hadn't seen from the basement. The paint, if there ever had been any, had completely chipped off and so now the doors were gray. They were nailed shut, so we ran back, neither of us wanted to be left behind, to grab a hammer from his dad's toolbox. We went to work on those doors, but there had to have been hundreds of nails there, just nailed in crooked and all over the place. It was getting darker by now, so we said that and went home. Next day I came over again and work continued. We had the doors open about halfway by now, and we could see the cellar underneath. Neither of us could fit through the space, though, so we kept pulling our nails. It was about 3 in the afternoon by the time we had finished, and when we got the doors open we found no stairs and a drop of about 10 feet. We peered into it as far as we could without falling in. It smelled so bad. We were sure it was the source of the smell in the old house. It was pretty tiny, as far as we could tell. It was narrow, and there was a large wall right in the center of it, with narrow paths along both sides, leading into the dark. The floor was stained, and we both knew it was blood. Maybe our kids' imaginations were going wild, though. Who knows? But one thing I do know is that sound will haunt me forever. The sound on the cassette. We played it that day, on his cassette player. It was static for about 5 minutes, and we were ready to give up. Then a scream. An awful, tortured scream. The screams continued, until it suddenly ended, right in the middle of one. Then static again. We threw away the cassette, and never spoke of it again, nor did we ever go into the house again. Something awful happened in that place. Unless it was a joke, which it could have been, and I hope it was. But I don't think so. We never unraveled the ball of twine. I unintentionally left it at his house that day, lying on the ground by the trampoline. Shortly after they bought a house and moved to an acreage in Sri Lanka, Minnesota, just 20 miles away. They still own the house. It sits empty now, and they use it to store things. Like mountain bikes, ironically. I still live in Fairmont. I could drive there, get the ball of twine, and unravel it. But I think it best to leave the ball of twine where it is. I don't want to have anything to do with that house ever again. Just to clarify, this happened not too long ago and has bewildered me and my friends that attended. Also, I am using another account as I don't want this tied to my main account. Throughout the year me and my friends have been going to an abandoned school close by to where we live, just on the outskirts of town. We liked to explore as it was big and quite an old building that looked cool and different. It was not open to the public in any way. Me and my friends had to find our own way in. There was a door that had been pried open by someone who was obviously there before us. In the many times we had been there we had always sworn to hear footsteps, voices, and one time my friend claimed to have seen someone and at the time none of us believed him. He wasn't known for telling the truth a lot. Anyways, we were usually in a group of 6, but one day it was just the 3 of us and we got bored and decided to go and check it out. Whilst we were there it seemed very eerie and quiet with the 3 of us till we heard a bang from the upper floor. We immediately had a retreat and ran outside the door, which was at the back. We hung around for a while and around the outside of the building for anything out of the ordinary. Bear in mind this was abandoned for years and years, but we saw lights, a lot of lights coming through a stained window to which we thought was a panel of buttons, almost like a janitor's office. We tried to peek through the windows, but we couldn't see anything. But then all of a sudden a loud screech came from the tannoids placed all around the building and some sort of loud noise continued to play. We decided to sprint and climb the fence only to hear a dog barking as if we were being chased by something. We all managed to climb over the fence, and as we glanced over, no dog in sight, no more noise coming from the speakers. It just grew quiet. Around a week or so later, word had spread quickly in the newspaper, on Facebook etc. that the school had burned down, no casualties and it wasn't planned. Suspicion grew, but nothing has come from it since. We haven't yet gone back to what remains, and I don't think we plan to. Some weird thing used to happen years ago here, in the exact same room I'm in at the moment. I had to rewrite this since my English is getting worse, but bear with me. I own a closet that is huge and has mainly two big mirrors that you can slide left to right with a wood structure inside with drawers. This closet is where I keep my clothes at the moment, and it's been around for more than 13 years. Years ago, I used to own a small and old Sony TV that fit perfectly inside the closet and used it almost every day. This one time I came home from a party, I sat down and started taking off my shoes, and I could hear static coming from inside the closet like someone was messing with my TV and left it on a bad channel. As I'm looking up straight to where the noise was coming from, someone or something punched the closet from the inside, and this was a strong and loud punch to the right closet door. The closet had both doors closed at the moment, so I just froze to death. I couldn't believe that shit, seriously, so I froze to death, full on goosebumps, and stared at the closet for at least 10 minutes before deciding to go towards it. I got real close to the right door and for some reason just tried hearing whatever was going on inside my closet, and boom, another punch, like a legit punch, almost like someone from the inside even knew I was standing right there. I opened the door and nothing. Everything was fine. I wanted to believe that somehow a drawer slides out and knocks on the door and then went back to its place somehow twice. So I slide the door and move on to the next weird thing, which is my small TV in the same closet that was on making a bunch of noise. I get the remote and slide the door, sit on my bed and look at the TV for a moment, and there it was, channel 666 on the TV. I'm not even kidding, I've been an atheist all my life just like my father. I don't believe in this kind of shit, but there it was. You know what's crazy? I switched channels and noticed that my small Sony TV could not go higher than 99 even with the remote. You could try to put channel 666 and it was always channel 99. I lived in an older house, built in the early 80s, and there were some weird things that would happen. Objects in places we didn't leave them, voices, lights, nothing particularly creepy though. Except after this. I have two brothers and we are all exactly 2 years apart. When I was young, roughly 9, my brothers about 7 and 5 shared a room. Across from the hall was my room. Our doorways looked at each other. I lived in an older house, built in the early 80s, and there were some weird things that would happen. Objects in places we didn't leave them, voices, lights, nothing particularly creepy though. Except after this. I have two brothers and we are all exactly 2 years apart. When I was young, roughly 9, my brothers about 7 and 5 shared a room. Across from the hall was my room. Our doorways looked at each other. I awoke late into the night/early morning as it was still dark to a methodic click sound. I could see my brother's light turning on, off, on, off, periodically and in succession. I wandered into the doorway and watched as my brother B sat in the top bunk, a look of horror on his drained-looking face with his little arm reached down clicking the light switch. I don't know how long I stood there, but soon my mother was at my back, watching for a moment before scolding my brother for being up so late and playing with the light. He turned, dead-eyed, to my mother and I and stared coldly for a few moments. In the most monotone voice I've ever heard from a 7-year-old, he told my mom they can only move in the dark. They keep getting closer. When I turn the light off, they can almost touch me now. Goodbye. My mom freaked, took all 3 of us to her room, shut and locked the door, and we slept with the light on. The next morning, I asked my brother what he saw. He again got a very dark look at him before explaining to me that children kept coming out of his closet. Except they were darker than the darkest shadow, except for white lines that surrounded the outline of their forms. They had empty white eyes. Every time the light was off they inched closer. When the light was on, they vanished. When the light turned back off, more descended from the closet and made their way to his bed, climbing up the bunk bed and reaching for him, but leaving the youngest alone and asleep. It freaked me out. But from here it only got worse. This became a nightly occurrence, and both my brothers soon began asking for a chain lock on the closet door. My mother obliged so they could finally get some sleep. I started staying with them at night to help them sleep. The night the lock was placed on the door, we fell asleep with relaxed fears. Until the door violently slammed open as far as the chain would allow, and I swear to God all three of us saw small black hands clawing through the gap. This became almost nightly. It quickly evolved into whispering coming from the door of the closet. Coos and coaxes to near the door. Desperate pleads to just let us out. My mom thought we had overactive and gruesome imaginations. Maybe she was right. This continued for almost a year, and as suddenly as it began it just stopped at the year mark. No sounds, no traces. No nothing. We carried on with life. Other strange things occurred from time to time. Some scary, some odd. We grew older. We stayed in that house for 13 years. We moved, and I moved out of my mom's house. I got my own place, and by some stroke of absent-mindedness moved into the house directly beside my childhood home. By now I had forgotten about all the strange things of my childhood and didn't remember them until I was walking my dog one night close to 3 a.m. You see, I work until midnight. So, I'm up all night. My brother's childhood bedroom window faces the backyard of my current home. I looked up as my dog started staring in that direction to find the light going on and off. Methodically. Very slowly. I found it strange. It became a nightly occurrence on my walk to look up and understand something clearly at last. I remembered the children from the closet. The strangest part for me is the family that moved into my old home is a single parent of 3 boys. Just like my family. And just like my family, the children were fairly close to the ages of 9, 7, and 5, give or take a year or two. After doing some research, I found that that particular house was built in 1980 or 1981. It held a nice young family until 1987 when an electrical fire broke out. The family was a father who worked in the mines and was often away, a stay-at-home mom, and her 3 boys, roughly 8, 6, and 4. When the fire broke out, the boys became trapped in the bedroom my brothers slept in. The boys of the original family died of smoke inhalation. Only 2 of the 3 bodies were recovered. The mother made it out of being alive and later took her own life. The house lay in ruin for 2 years and was rebuilt in 1989 to 1990. In that time several strange deaths occurred. Spouses moved in with an infant daughter who died of SIDS 5 months after moving in. In 1991 a single man moved in and hung himself in the basement. In 1993 or 1994 a large family of 6 containing a mother, father, 3 boys and a daughter moved in. The daughter slit her wrists in the bathtub and died of blood loss. A year later the oldest son shot himself in the basement. The house remained empty until 1997 when a widow and her daughter moved in. No incidents were recorded, and the family moved out in 1999, the year my brother was born. Families were in and out without incident until 2004 when my family moved in. We moved out in 2012. When I was in high school I lived with my aunt in Oregon while my parents and brother were all still in Arizona. One night I had a very vivid dream of driving up to a lookout spot above a canyon and parking my car behind my brother's truck. As I was getting out of my car I noticed that there were 2 other people there besides myself, my brother who had his back turned to me as he looked out over the canyon, and my brother's friend Brian who was walking toward me. Brian said hello and that it was nice to see me, but I should just go. I didn't understand why I had to leave, and I couldn't keep my eyes off of my brother. I asked Brian what was wrong with my brother, but he wouldn't tell me. I knew there was something seriously off about my brother, but I couldn't tell exactly what it was. I woke up the next morning with the dream still in my head. It didn't fade throughout the day either. Instead, it kept haunting me. I knew I was missing something that I couldn't figure out, so I kind of forced myself to forget about it. At about 5 p.m. that evening I was woken up by my father who was looking for my mom's phone number. My brother had been snowboarding earlier that day and he jumped off of a small cliff and broke his leg 6 places below the knee. Was my dream trying to tell me that something was going to happen to my brother? Was the accident supposed to be worse? Why was I warned? Was it a simple coincidence? If so, why have I never had a dream about my brother before or since? A couple of weeks ago, I was on a Postmates run with a friend. He's a driver. We got to this apartment complex and saw a lady come downstairs with her dog, a cute little thing. I waved to him and her just kind of gives me a blank stare. Okay, rude, whatever. We go up to the second floor via the only elevator in the whole complex and deliver the package, and as we're turning back down the hallway we came, we see the same lady and dog come walking towards us. That's weird, we just saw her downstairs a couple of seconds ago. There's either a second elevator in this building, there wasn't, we checked, or she really hauled upstairs while we were going up via the real elevator. She turns left and disappears. We assume she just went down a second stairway that we didn't see coming up the first time and followed her since we needed to get down anyways and didn't want to take the elevator. Nope, she turned left into a dead-end brick wall. She and the dog are nowhere to be found, not on the street outside or in the alley behind the building. What? We scoured the whole building and found out that there's only one stairway, on the opposite side of the building, and only one elevator, the one that we used. So how did she get up there so quickly, and how did she get down without passing us if she didn't take the elevator and we clearly saw her turn left into a brick wall? Ghosts. That's how. I swear we ran into a man from another time. My stepsister and I were like maybe 9 and 11 years old and we adventured like 10 kilometers from the house into the forest to explore and play. Grew up rural, this is just what you do. We were way off the trail amongst these enormous valleys, by Ontario standards. Like the type that you can't just walk straight up because it's too steep. So, this isn't an easy place to really get to and there are very few houses that back onto this particular piece of land. We were walking about and chatting when all of a sudden this man appears like 3 feet from us wearing a cowboy hat and a suede-like vest. He walked by, again, not anywhere near any trail, and didn't say anything. Then all of a sudden we didn't see him anymore. He was heading downhill, so we should have had a good vantage point to continue seeing him, but he was gone. You'd think if you randomly came across any other person in such a place you'd be like, oh, hey, what's up, or hey, have a nice walk or something. But he didn't even look at us, just walked by silently then disappeared. At the time it was like meh, strange, and we continued playing around, but a few years later we realized how strange that was. Just inexplicable and odd. Early 1980s I arrested a young man who was released from a mental health program by Ron Reagan during the beginnings of his term. This peculiar young man would sneak into the campground where I was a ranger to cut the crotches out of young girls' panties and swimsuits. He would take the cotton part that actually touches the vagina and cut or bite it free and steal them. Reports became more frequent of him making his thefts and we felt he was escalating. I was made aware of a recent theft and found tracks on a horse trail, so I ventured after him alone, stupid in hindsight. We did not have portable radios capable of transmitting over distances/terrain, but I strongly felt a child was in danger and this was my best shot to capture him. After 2 hours running on trails, I finally found him and his camp. It was a small tent with several stolen food items and bags of pants and swimsuits and bras scattered. He had a bag with a linoleum knife, clothesline, and duct tape on him. I disarmed him and gathered what evidence I could in a backpack. He was handcuffed, and I tied a rope hobble to one on his leg so it would drag, allowing me to step on it to trip him if he ran. I explained to him this was no joke and I would take any deviation from my orders as an attempt on my life and I would shoot him. It registered half-heartedly in his mind, but you could see he wasn't well. I made him run the trail ahead of me screaming the Star-Spangled Banner so I could hear where he was as I kept my head on a swivel, not knowing if we were alone or not deep in the woods. We double-timed with only a break for water 2 hours to the road where I walked him at gunpoint to a meet-up with a state trooper. He was returned to a state psych hospital. At last I knew he was still alive. I survived Vietnam and that was still the scariest day of my life. The boy never spoke a word to me, but he did comply quickly and easily. He just wasn't there, his eyes were dead. I may as well have been talking at the body at a wake. When my mom was pregnant with my older brother, I'm the youngest of 3, she started having some trouble sleeping. She kept hearing a weird sound at night. She chalked it up to a weird pregnancy brain. As the nights went on, she was able to hear it more clearly. It sounded like a baby crying. She wakes up my dad once she's sure and asks him to take a look around. They lived out in the country, and it wasn't uncommon for animals to creep around the house. Also, animals make all kinds of weird noises that can sound similar to that. They assume it's a fox or young raccoons maybe. My dad looks around and finds nothing. This goes on for a few nights and he never finds anything. He also never hears the cries. But my mom isn't sleeping. She wakes up every night to the sound of a baby crying. She's honestly kind of losing it. One of my dad's friends from work told him to check the cellar where the former owner of the home used to lock his kids up. My dad brushed this off because small country rumors are useless it's creepy and would throw my mom over the edge and they don't even have a cellar. But after a few weeks my dad is desperate to find an answer. They're not sleeping well, and his pregnant wife is severely upset. Thinking about the cellar comment, he decides to start inspecting the house. One thing leads to another, and he ends up ripping up the, now, living room carpet. There is a small square latched panel on the floor. He opens it and finds a small crawlspace with a dirty floor and dusty children's toys strewn about. Needless to say, he closed that up quickly and my mom never heard the crying again. Warning, gory details. When I was 10 we found the house of our dreams. It was right by a busy intersection, but the trees out front kept our house hidden and blocked the sound. When we finished moving in we celebrated by going to get ice cream. When we came home our gate was open and my brother's laptop was missing. We filed a report and an officer arrived and searched the house. In the attic he found a bag of marijuana. After that nothing happened for about 3 months. We felt safe and went to Monterey Bay for the weekend. When we came back the windows in the shop were shattered and the kitchen was a mess. One day after we found a man searching our back acre with a dog, my dad yelled at him, and he ran off over the fence. Christmas time came and went, and nothing happened. In March of 2014, our elderly neighbors across the road had been gone a while and we had seen some people in their mid-20s, which got us very weary. We stayed up at night listening and we kept hearing them saying things like, just go and break in, and they're outside, wait until they go in. 1 month later, the police officers, ambulances and a fire truck showed up at the house searching for something with dogs. We didn't go over asking anything and my mom and dad decided to move. Over the course of 2 weeks, we had moved out mostly. We saw the old couple's house being boarded by cops. We went over and asked what happened. Turns out the elderly couple was murdered and chopped to pieces and shoved in fridge. When a friend of theirs went over he reported a smell of decaying flesh. The next day we came back for our appliances to find them all out on the lawn. And our baby grand piano sawed in half. There are 4 suspects, and 1 has been arrested. The house is now for sale commercially in Elk Grove, California. First, I'd like to preface this story by saying that I consider myself a pretty rational person. I understand intrinsically that there has to be some explanation for it, but I don't know what it is. Okay. When I was 11 I went to a summer camp type place with my classroom for 4 days. I don't remember the name, but I do remember that every one of the kids had immediate weird vibes when we got there. Lots of kids waking up crying wanting to go home, meltdowns, general not fun when it should have been fun. Kids wandering off into the woods. Camp counselors miserable. One night I woke up to the sound of tapping on the window. At first I thought it was just a branch or something, but the tapping followed a rhythm. It went tap 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 tap. Once I figured out that it wasn't random I got more scared than I've ever been in my life. Were we being pranked by another cabin? I ran into the nook our counselor slept in and started to wake him up. The clock next to him was deep into early morning, maybe 3 a.m. He woke up and got mad at me, telling me to go back to bed. I understood that it wasn't a prank at that point. I went and laid in my bed. Soon after it started again. Eventually it stopped. I was terrified and didn't go back to sleep. The next day it was weird. It's normal for kids to be scared, but I was caught on by some questioning my own morality. I refused to go canoeing cause I was convinced we would die. If I was near the woods I was overcome with a desire to walk deep into them and that terrified me more. This wasn't normal little kid scared, this was a deep existential acceptance of the possibility of my own death, and I feel like 11 is kinda young for that, but maybe not. The whole trip I couldn't hang. Even on the school bus back I was convinced something would happen to the bus. I didn't feel normal for weeks. Everyone I talked to about it denied it. They were sleeping, the other cabins had no clue, there was no pranking going on to corroborate the possibility of that being it. It had to be something rational, but for my life of me I don't know what it is. The space next to the window was free of branches. Maybe it was a deer? Who knows? A couple of years ago I was a troubled unit student, so I often went for midnight 1 a.m. walks to try to gather my thoughts. Towards the end of one of my walks at almost 2 a.m. towards the end of winter, my legs were tired, and I saw a lamp post ahead of me illuminating the otherwise dark semi-rural street, so I thought no one else is around, I will sit down for a little bit. So, I sat down on the lamppost for a little bit of rest. Naturally, the moment I sat down, someone turned the corner and walked towards me. A hooded hunchback figure, male around my age, 20-ish. As this guy walks past me, he speaks to me in a quiet, mumbling kind of voice. Caught off guard, I tried my best to hear what he said, and I pieced together D over there as he gestured towards a nearby roundabout with a circular brick wall in the center. Due to the brick wall and me sitting on the floor, it made sense to me that he shyly said, "You can sit down over there." Slightly confused and a little embarrassed, I said thanks a lot to him and shot him an over-the-top smile. He slunk away and I felt obliged to walk over to the roundabout to at least sit down for a tiny bit, and as I got closer and closer I noticed bouquets of flowers, wooden crosses, and letters. Turns out a father had died there very recently. The more I thought about it, the more I'm certain that guy said to me, "My dad died over there." Before slinking off sadly into the 2 a.m. darkness. Needless to say, I felt awful as it sank in, and I walked back home. So yes, just to clarify, at 2 a.m. in some random street, some sad young guy told me his dad died, and I replied by saying thanks, smiled at him and walked away. So, my mom works in a building as a caseworker, normal job, normal place, everything's good. There's a building about 100 yards away from them that's a mental health facility. The facility shut down in 2013 due to lack of funding. One day, some years after it shut down, a few police officers come into her office to say that they would be using the building occasionally for drills, firefighters would do the same, so they made sure everyone knew so they wouldn't be alarmed. Fast forward about a week, a few people coming into the office say they could hear a bunch of banging and yelling coming from the abandoned psych ward. They saw people running frantically and just screaming like you'd never heard someone scream. They called the police officers, knowing that it couldn't have been a drill, and they were right, there was no one in the building and there weren't any drills within a week of that day. Police even investigated and concluded that there was no sign of entry from a homeless person or any animals. The ladies in the office, they're mostly women there, said they'd seen people walking there before when it was empty but assumed it was just harmless homeless people. They knew what it was after that day. About 6 weeks later, the officers come back into the office and say they won't be having drills there anymore. That the dogs would act up and they would hear yells or bangs that would disturb the drill because no one could tell if it was intentional or not. The officers seemed pretty shaken, saying some of the screams were not of human nature. It's been closed for good ever since, no one is allowed in that building anymore. Even though the electricity is completely cut off to that building, the ladies to this day will see lights turning on and off for no apparent reason. Definitely a profoundly creepy story. When I was 10, I went with my grandmother to visit my uncle for a week. He lived in an older house that was on the same land right next to an old cemetery that dated back to the Civil War. One day I was swinging on the porch swing when something inside the house caught my eye. Through the screen door I saw a man sitting on the couch with his back to me. The couch covered most of him, but I could see his dark hair, and he was wearing a red and black plaid shirt. He didn't look familiar. My uncle was at work, and it definitely wasn't my grandmother. But I didn't feel scared or threatened. I remember feeling peaceful as I walked to the door. I could see him through the screen as I started opening it, and once it was fully open he was just gone. I figured I had imagined it or saw some type of shadow and my eyes were playing tricks, so I continued playing. I never thought about it again or ever told anyone about it. Fast forward about 30 years and my uncle comes down to visit. We are reminiscing over dinner and the subject of ghosts comes up, and he talks about the old house by the cemetery and how from time to time he would catch a glimpse from the corner of his eye of a guy with dark hair wearing a red and black plaid shirt. And just like in the movies, I dropped my fork onto the plate making a loud noise, causing everyone to look at me. My eyes had widened, my jaw dropped, and I turned white. My wife was scared because she thought something had happened to me. After I snapped out of it, I told them my story, leaving out the calm and peaceful feelings I had. My uncle ended with how he thought was a good guy ghost, because no matter how he was feeling, he would always feel a wave of calmness and peace when he saw the sky out of the corner of his eye. So, this is not my spookiest, but found this weird because it happened this morning after I was reading this thread last night. Also, this did not happen to me but to my wife. We lost one of our dogs this October, and it hit both of us pretty hard. We were cleaning yesterday, and I was putting all of our dog toys in the living room for our dog to play with. While I was cleaning, I found the dog that past favorite toy, which they both loved. It's this orange egg with a face on it, so I brought it out to let our dog play with that one too. It was actually the only toy that I brought out that he ended up playing with. Fast forward to this morning, my wife wakes up at 5 a.m. on the dot, which is weird for her since she normally wakes up at around 6, so she decides to get ready for work. At this point, all of the toys are in the living room still. As she was using her curling iron, she looked over, and our dog, who was fairly large, was lying in between the bedroom and the bathroom watching her get ready. It was while she was looking at him she heard the squeak of the orange egg toy, which anyone who has been around a large quantity of different dog toys will tell you each toy has a different squeak. She looked over and our large dog was still laying there and had not moved. She said it sounded like it came from the office, which had its door closed, but she looked all around, even in the bed where I was still sleeping, to see if I had rolled on a toy, but all of them were still in the living room. The weird thing is the office is where his paw print is that we got from the vet when he passed, as well as some of his fur that we are going to frame with the print. She told me about it while we were driving to work, and we decided to think that it was him dropping in to say hello. Again, not terribly spooky, but just thought it was weird that it happened the morning after reading this thread last night, which my wife did not know that I read. I used to act with a theater company which operated out of a building that dated back 800-odd years. Obviously, with a building of that age, there were lots of ghost stories, but I don't believe in ghosts, so paid them no heed, but enjoyed watching people freaking out. I'd been there a couple of years when they renovated one of the attic rooms and updated it to be a changing room. We'd rehearse from autumn, then have 6 weeks of performance over 6 weeks in the summer, with 3 different plays alternating over this time. I was in one play but got roped in to do some background work / crowd scenes in one of the other plays, The Tempest. In one of the final scenes, my costume consisted of essentially a white stocking covering my face, a huge white unkempt wig, and a loincloth with body paint. I was an angry spirit of sorts, lurking in shadows. One night it was coming up to the final scene, but for reasons I can't recall now I didn't go on stage. I was one of many, so had no impact on the scene. I left the theater and walked through the woods to the back entrance of the hall. It's an outdoor theater. The changing room was in the nearest roof in the pick. Lots of changes since that pick. Slipped through the hall and took the back stairs up to the changing room. The room used to be servant quarters, so the entrance was really tight, about as wide as my shoulders, and up about 4 floors of wooden stairs. Halfway up I could hear someone singing in the changing room. Brilliant, I thought, no one is expecting me here. This is the perfect opportunity to scare the shit out of one of my friends. So, pulling my mask over my face, fixing my wig, I crept up the final 2 floors, readied myself by the open door, and leapt into the room. The room was empty. The singing, which had gotten louder as I climbed the stairs, had stopped the second I leapt into the room. I was confused. Then I was terrified. The singing was as real as if someone was standing next to me. There was no way anyone was hiding. There was no way out of that room without physically moving me to pass me on the stairs. I noped and ran back to the theater to wait for other sensible adults to escort me back up to get changed. People thought I was joking when I told them, until they could see how utterly bewildered and freaked I was. Later, when the audience had gone, we tried shouting and calling from outside to see if the noise could have come from somewhere else. Nothing. I still don't believe in ghosts, but there was 100% singing coming from a room with no people in it. I have no explanation, but that fear has stuck with me for 25 years. My father's cousin was getting married, and she was shipping her wedding dress from the bridal store to us. My mother was going to be doing some alterations on the dress. I clearly remember the box coming because my mother was remarking on the condition of the box. Fast forward a few days later, I was with my great aunt talking about the wedding dress. She remarked about the condition of the box from shipping as well. I told her that my mother agreed when it came to our house. My great aunt turns to look at me saying that's cool and quickly changes the subject. Later that night, my parents came up to me saying that my great aunt called them and told them about the conversation. My mother tells me I must remember wrong since the box was never there, nor has she even seen what the box looks like. I get frustrated and tell her that she has seen the box and I run through the whole conversation we had days before. Again, she tells me that never happened. We go back and forth till I'm crying because no one remembers it happening but me. I know it happened because I was there talking to her. I even remember how the light from the window hit the box and carpet. It was terrifying. I felt like I was going crazy. I just put it out of my mind, but to this day I still stand by the fact that it happened. Was in my college house alone in the evening. All roommates were back home with family out of state. I took a shower and when I opened the bathroom boot afterwards, the ottoman from the chair in the living room on the other side of the house was in front of the door. As I'm walking back to the living room, I notice all the coats that had been hung up on the hooks in the front hall are gone and there are tennis rackets hung up in their place. The tennis rackets had been there in the front hall closet, so I looked in the closet and all the coats are hung on hangers, including my own, which I had put on the hook not an hour ago, and I never hung my coat in the closet. Basically, my grandparents lived in a house where they were on the first floor and their neighbors were on the ground floor, separate entrances to each house. Anyway, they used to mention lots of weird feelings/smells in the house and how they'd see shadowy figures, or the place would suddenly turn ice cold before returning to room temperature. Some of the neighbors in the street would tell them that whilst they were at work there was a man who would stand at one of the windows and peek out from time to time. Anyway, the incident that prompted them to move house was because one day my gran got home from work just after lunchtime. She worked in a nearby primary school, and she heard a huge banging noise from the kitchen. She ran into the kitchen and all the dishes/plates etc. were lying in the middle of the kitchen floor, smashed into pieces but in a neat pile. All the drawers and cabinets were swung open with the overhead ones hanging from the hinges. Their downstairs neighbors ran in the house because they heard the noises and were worried. They couldn't believe what had happened. Not long after that they decided to move house. My gran has literally hundreds of stories about the weird things that happened in that house, but that was the most sinister. Several years ago, when my son was young I was sitting at the computer doing some work when I heard him wake up. He made the tiny whimper sound and the typical toddler, pathetic sounding cry/moan mommy. So, I jumped up to get him. Then I remembered my son was not home. He had been on a sleepover at my parents'. We lived in a slightly older house, built in the 1940s. There are a few weird things that happened there. Not my story but my mother's. Her dad was never a great dad. He was a bit drunk and somewhat belligerent, but she knew that he did really love his daughter. I don't remember when she said he divorced my grandmother, but it wasn't a fun time, and he got a new girlfriend rather quickly. But he would always stop by on her birthday and get her something. The last time my mom saw her dad was on her 14th birthday and he died sometime later that year. But she swears up and down that on the morning of her 15th birthday while she was brushing her hair that this little music box that he bought her on her 14th birthday started to play on its own. It only managed the first 6 or 7 notes and then stopped, but she swears it had to be her dad wishing her happy birthday. My brother's first house, 50 years old, suburbia single story. Saw my brother's pregnant wife open the door to her bedroom, closed it behind her and walked into the baby's room, waited about an hour, checked to see why she was still in there, nobody. They went to a doctor's appointment, I was home alone, went to go to the bathroom, the door was locked, I knocked on it thinking I was not home alone, no answer. I used the second bathroom, the door is also locked. I knocked on it, hear the lock open and entered an empty room. I ask them about it and my sister-in-law freaks out. She is Indian Hindu and believe ghosts are a bad omen or something. I never mention it again to them. I must have been about 8 at the time. A couple of friends and I were spending our Saturday at another friend's house. So, a little backstory: she had recently moved into this house. It had a walled-off room, which is creepy in itself. Why does a room need walled off? It had a window. Her dad was planning to knock in it that weekend. So, we were playing outside the house, and she looks up to see her grandma at this window. We all seen her and got excited because her grandma would make us the best butterscotch pudding, so we all ran inside to find her mum crying and her dad comforting her. Turns out the grandma had just died in a freak accident. We just assumed that her dad had already knocked into the room, but it hadn't been touched. I have many creepy stories. Living in Scotland, a lot of houses are old, so noises etc. can generally be put down to that, but this one stuck with me. I can still see her face in that window. When my cousin and I were 14/15, we both got to know a site where a spirit would answer all your questions. My cousin found out about this at school and knew it was a trick. You could type the answer over the question without the other person knowing, and wanted to use it to trick me. I didn't know the trick myself and got a bit suspicious after all of the things I asked were answered correctly, so I asked it to show a sign of it being present. My cousin jokingly typed "turn around." We both did, and only a few seconds later one of the plastic birds my parents had at the time started moving its wings. We were both in the living room with my parents. My cousin and I both freaked out and checked whether there was anything that could have made it move, but we couldn't find anything. Stopped using the site straight after that. I was around 9 years old sleeping over at my friend's house. He was around 9 as well. Early in the morning we saw a huge circle out the window. It looked like the sun does early in the morning, but it was around 15x the size of the sun and a little less bright. We talked to his douchebag father the next day, and he said it was the farms behind his house burning vegetation, but I really don't believe that at all. It was a large circle like the sun. I once saw a demon-like creature in my parents' room when I was really young. It wasn't paralysis, I was lucid and able to move, and really wasn't even that afraid. As I was so young I didn't immediately associate things that looked scary as bad, I guess. Also, I'm convinced the apartment I'm living in is haunted. When I first moved in, I kept having nightmares and daytime visions of a girl who'd hung herself in my bathroom. They gradually went away, but ever since I started the process of moving out, I leave in 2 days, things have gone insane. The closet door keeps opening by itself. I've watched bags in the kitchen and the comforter on my bed shuffle around on their own. I've seen other people in the bathroom mirror, and I've been having increasingly bizarre and vivid nightmares. The one last night involved me getting out of bed, promptly falling back over, and having a seizure, something I'm not prone to at all, and I seriously don't know if it happened for real or not. I think whatever is here is upset that I'm leaving. Funny way of showing it. This happened when I was 13 or 14, during the summer break between grades. I had a habit of staying up until around 7 a.m. playing computer games, not even really feeling tired until I saw sunlight outside. The family computer was in the family room, next to the kitchen, with a hallway going to the back of the house. It was about 2 a.m., all the lights in the house were off, except for the monitor of the computer. I heard footsteps coming down the hall from the back of the house towards the kitchen, and I figured it was my mom coming out to tell me to go to bed. I turned towards the hallway and put my hand up between my eyes and the monitor so I could see, and this little girl, maybe 7 or 8, came walking out of the hallway. She was barefoot, wore a white nightgown, had her head bowed down like she was looking at the floor, and had long blonde hair which covered her face. I immediately froze with fear, and she turned towards me, lifted her head, and stared at me for a second, then lowered her head again, and walked back up the hallway where she came from. My parents have a loose floorboard in the hallway that creaks every time someone steps on it, and I heard that board as whatever it was that I just saw walk back up the hallway. After a minute just staring at the entrance to the hallway, I turned on all the lights in the house, one by one, leapfrogging my way back to my bedroom. I was hanging out in my basement once as a kid. It had been finished and decorated, favorite place in the house. I was between 6 and 8, and no one else was down there. I was just playing with my Legos when I heard a voice say my name, a voice I was entirely sure was my grandfather. Not all of our basement was finished, but most of it. There was one section we used for storage which my family called the other side. Now, this wasn't for any particular reason other than it just wasn't like the rest and we didn't have anything of real interest in there. I followed my child's instincts, which led me to the door to the other side. I generally didn't go in there due to my fear of the dark, which, over a decade later, I'm still working on, and the lights in there were turned on by a string and were all a good distance in. I went up to the door to open it and check inside to look for Gramps, but the knob wouldn't budge, and it felt like there was something blocking the door. Odd, as the door had no lock to speak of and we made sure nothing could fall to block it. After a minute, I tried again and got in, no problem. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual hungry darkness I felt from that unexplored room. I closed the door and jogged my chubby toddler upstairs to tell my mom what happened, but when I did, she reminded me that my grandfather had died when I was 3 and I was at the funeral. Thinking what could have been calling me, or perhaps I was just hearing things, I just nodded and went back to my Legos and turned on all the lights and the TV in the basement. I never liked The Other Side. Definitely not after that. Late to the party, but my parents lived in a house in an old town in Massachusetts that had been built in the early 1800s or so. The thing was beautiful and a classic example of a federal, and ghosts never crossed my mind when they moved in. I was in college at the time, so when I was at home I slept on the 3rd floor, which had exposed beams and a fireplace and was overall a large room they used as a second living/TV room. I never got the creeps in the room, though it was just a cool TV room. After a year of them living there, I had become used to my mom and little brother talking about the lady they would see and hear at night, but I just let them talk and pretended I didn't think they were weird. That switched when I was home for a few nights at Christmas in 2012. First time anything happened, I was sound asleep until I felt the bed lightly shake. I thought one of the dogs bumped into it, so half asleep I rolled over and opened my eyes to see what if they wanted to sleep on the bed with me, but instead of one of my parents' mutts I noticed a person. I assumed it was my mom and didn't realize her walking me up silently with all the lights off was weird, so I grabbed my phone for light and looked up again and I froze, went cold and just stayed there starting at a middle-aged woman dressed in mid-1800s clothes maybe, and she just looked tight back for what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes. My phone would go dark, and I'd light it back up and she remained stationary. She then walked away, and I lost sight of her as she approached the closed door which never opened, and she was gone. I didn't sleep a wink more that night. Honestly, I couldn't tell you what she looked like and didn't notice any colors, but the lighting sucks, so I couldn't tell you if she looked like a ghost or a normal person. 2 nights later I woke up wide awake and knew something or someone was looking at me. I was positive someone was looking at me, yet I couldn't move. I was cold and frozen, I couldn't even make a noise. I stayed there laying down, eyes wide open, confident that someone was behind me standing on the bed. All the lights were off, and I could see the door was closed, but I swear to God that lady was watching me. Eventually the feeling faded, and I grew bold and quickly rolled over and turned on the TV. When the glow came on I didn't see anyone. I never experienced anything at that house again, but my mom and brother did. About once a month one of them had a story. There were stories of women died in the house in the basement, but we never could prove that. We did have evidence the Underground Railroad used the house, though that's cool. I'm not a big ghost person, but those 2 nights still scare me when I think about it, and I have no explanation for what happened. I don't miss that house much. To start of this comment, I absolutely do not believe in anything supernatural, but there's 2 things that come to mind I just can't explain and honestly freak me out, and they both pertain to phenomena I've experienced firsthand. Both of my stories happened when I was locked up as a juvenile within a 6-month period. I won't get into details about what I did, but it ended with 3 months of lock-up in a juvenile detention center followed by 9 months of rehabilitation. The detention center I was in was located in Hawthorne, Nevada. It was an old military medical building that was repurposed when whatever war was going on was over. Anyways, as you can probably guess, a lot of people took their final breaths there, and naturally, because a ton of kids went through there, you could take your pick of all the ghost stories that circulated. Dead girls walking the hallways, soldiers missing limbs appearing in people's dreams, and on and on. Of course, I never believed any of them. What you have to understand also is I'm a heavy sleeper. Always have been. I could sleep through a storm. Growing up in a household with 4 other kids of varying ages and parents constantly on the verge of divorce, always fighting, teaches you to sleep deep when you finally get the chance. One night I was in a dead sleep, business as usual. I felt a very sharp rush of electricity akin to being shocked by a weak handheld teaser. I shot straight up in bed and saw a strange dark mass right above me to the right of my bunk. It's hard to really describe what it looked like, but it was transparent, yet solid, like a dark cloud that didn't have enough water vapor in it. I stared at the thing for a solid 3 seconds before it moved quickly up out of sight near the ceiling. It was dark during the lights out with just enough light from the window that everything below eye level you could see if your eyes were adjusted, but further up near the ceiling was pitch black. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I haven't seen anything remotely like that before or since. After I was transferred out of that place, I was moved to a facility that was essentially a cabin in the woods in Mt. Charleston, which is just outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. The first night I was there I started experiencing something that I didn't even know how to name, but after some research I figured out it was sleep paralysis. For anyone that doesn't know what it is, essentially you get locked into your own body while falling asleep or waking up. You're completely immobilized, yet aware of your body and your current state. It's extremely lucid because even though your body is technically asleep, your mind is wide awake. This can lead to some interesting things. The one thing that stuck with me a lot was astral projection. Apparently, people claimed they could actually move their spiritual body separately from their physical body during certain times of sleep, but sleep paralysis was the easiest time. I learned this during my research about sleep paralysis. We got limited computer time to do classes online, but of course I would use the time to do whatever I wanted. Anyways, I figured out may as well try and have some fun with this typically bad situation. Seriously, if you've experienced sleep paralysis, it sucks. So, I started experimenting to try to move around outside of my body while I was immobilized, and to my surprise, I actually started to make progress. I started by sitting up, then eventually managed to move around my room, then the whole cabin and even made some excursions outside. I didn't believe for a single second that any of this was real in the slightest. I rationalized it by saying my mind was just using familiar surroundings and actions to utilize my fully awake sleeping mind to envision whatever it wanted, which included walking around while my physical body was lying in bed. One morning it was quite different though. My internal clock was set to about 30 minutes to wake up, and this was prime time for sleep paralysis, and my current pastime of astral projection, which I still thought was a load of horse dirt. I started my usual routine of sitting up to get up out of the bed and start walking around. Except this time, I didn't manage to sit up or get out of bed at all. I got stuck about halfway up in a sitting position. My legs were locked down to the bed and my wrists felt like they were shackled down to the bed. This has never happened to me before, and it scared the hell out of me. I looked back and the strangest thing happened. I actually saw my sleeping body underneath me asleep. I had never stopped to look back where I was sleeping, and I found it strangely creepy to see myself back there. Like I said, I figured all of this was just my mind playing tricks on me, so why would my mind even bother rendering itself back there? It was deeply unsettling to me. By now I'm in full panic mode. Adrenaline pumping and I'm getting more lucid by the second. During my early sleep paralysis sessions and even when I started moving around it was pretty strange, so it would cause me to wake up when I'd get particularly scared or uncomfortable, but I wasn't waking up at all this time. I turned around and faced the rest of the room and I saw the most awful thing I've ever seen or probably ever will see in my entire life. I thought the black cloud from earlier was scary, but it had nothing on this. It was a humanoid figure in the closet in the room. Its proportions were all screwed up, super skinny arms and legs with a stout torso and a misshapen head. It had sicklied white skin with yellow blotches covering it head to toe. It didn't have genitals or a single hair on its entire body from head to toe, yet I could still tell it was male somehow. The worst part was its face. It was completely blank, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, no ears, just completely blank, yet despite the lack of eyes the thing was looking right at me. I've never been so scared in my entire life, locked down in my bed unable to move at all, and of course it has to start moving towards me. Its legs and arms contorted and twisted around in impossible ways until it was low to the ground and rushed me at me inconceivably fast until it was directly face to face with me. I woke up at that exact instant sweaty, screaming and thrashing around in my bed. No one knew what was wrong with me and I refused to tell or even speak to anyone for the rest of the day. It seriously scared me, and I was terrified of falling asleep for weeks afterwards. Strangely, that incident completely cured my sleep paralysis, and I haven't had another occurrence since then, and I've slept soundly ever since. This comment ended up turning out a lot longer than I meant it to, but this is the first time I've ever told these stories to anyone for fear of getting dismissed as made-up stories or my mind just playing tricks on me, and they stick out so vividly in my memory. I still don't believe in the supernatural, but I honestly can't explain how or why these things happen to me. I have a few spooky stories to share, these stand out the most though. I guess this one is more weird/sad than spooky, but when I was a teenager I snuck out with a boy I liked, and we went to this empty cabin to get high and fool around. I lived in a really rural area, so thought of woods everywhere and no other house around for about a mile. The cabin itself was about a mile from the main road in the woods. It was pouring rain, and by the time we got there I was already pretty creeped out. Anyway, there was a random dead cow inside the cabin. It was small, still a calf, and had been dead so long that it didn't even stink. It was just bones and skin. There were no pastures nearby, and the cabin actually still had the door intact, and it was closed when we arrived, so someone had to have carried it in there and either left it to starve or killed it. We didn't notice any occult stuff, which might have made sense. The whole thing was confusing. When I got out of high school I worked in an assisted living facility that cost residents upwards of $10,000 per month. It was basically luxury condos with nursing staff. We had a lot of empty, locked apartments upstairs. We always had empty space. The call lights in one of those empty rooms had a tendency to go off late at night, and there was no way for it to accidentally go off since they were pull strings. I thought that was just a weird thing about the one room until it happened in an occupied room. The resident was fast asleep in her bedroom, but the call light in the living room was pulled. Her room was right next to the nurse's station, and no one had been inside. The night nurse laughed at me and the other CNA on duty and said she was used to it. The single scariest thing that ever happened to me was when I was 5 or 6. My mom had just remarried, and we moved into a really old house. I was excited to have my own room, and I took the biggest one right off the living room. It had a large walk-in closet, which is somewhat unusual for houses that are old. I was a restless sleeper and would often wake myself up rolling out of bed, so when it happened to me on the first night staying in that room I didn't think much of it until I looked at the closet door. It had been shut but slid open about a foot. I saw a shadow darker than the darkness of the closet, with red eyes. It put a hand on the wall outside the closet and I booked it out of there. My parents moved my stuff the next day because I refused to sleep or even play with my toys in there after that. The only other thing that happened there happened to my stepdad. He had someone press themselves up against him while he was at the stove cooking. Thinking it was my mom, he turned around and no one was there. Late one night when I was about 15, my best friend and I were outside of my house on the curb sneaking cigarettes, sharing a beer. You know, usual rebellious teenager stuff. Now my housing development is kind of large and surrounded by woods, and I happen to live right near one of the corners, so to speak, of the neighborhood. So, the houses across the street from mine all have woods behind them. All of a sudden we hear a terrifying screeching sound coming from the woods directly across from us. We both booked it inside, leaving our beer and pack of smoke on the street. She and I both said we thought it was a chupacabra because the sound was so out of this world. The windows in the front of my house weren't covered by the curtains, and we felt like we were still being watched inside, so we closed them. Here's the sad news, our parents were kind of hands-off, so she and I walked everywhere. We were now faced with the struggle of me walking her home, which meant all the way out of my neighborhood, then through a larger neighborhood with big spaced-out houses, then a shortcut through some woods over a makeshift bridge that cut into her condominium development, about a 20-minute walk, all uphill, in the pitch black. Still, we waited a good 30 minutes before beginning the walk, thinking we'd be in the clear by then. Nope. We felt we were being watched the entire time. We kept hearing noises behind us, leaves crunching, twigs snapping, footsteps, etc. So, all freaked out, we finally reached the woodsy shortcut to her neighborhood. Now at that time I had an Verizon cell phone, so I flipped it open to provide us light for walking through the shortcut. About halfway through, she and I saw two huge green eyes that were near as tall off the ground as us. At that point it was a fight or flight for both of us, so we parted ways, and I ran as fast as I could the entire downhill trek back to my house. The whole time I was convinced I would lose balance and trip and get eaten alive, but thank God I made it home in one piece, albeit scared. Being a bit older now, a logical explanation would be that we were being hunted by a cougar, the scream, stalking behavior, the eyes were feline in nature. However, I live in Orange County, New York, and there are not supposed to be any mountain lions left here since the 20th century. Whatever it was, we both felt like prey that night, and it inspired both of us to always carry mace, to this day. TLDR, my friend and I were stalked for over the course of an hour by a mountain lion/unknown creature. When I was little, around 4 to 5, my family had a huge plasma screen TV in the wall in the downstairs of our home. One day I was watching some Boomerang or was on my N64 or whatever, and then the TV cuts out, goes to static. I sit there for about 30 seconds seeing if I accidentally unplugged it, and then I swear to this day I saw something crawling out of the TV about 5 to 6 feet tall and mildly human shaped. It terrified me whatever it was, so I sprint upstairs and go to my mom to get help. She turns the stove down and we go back down and there was nothing, and the TV is back with my game on it. When I try to explain this vivid memory to people, they say I may have had an active imagination, but I swear it was real. I grew up in a haunted house in which multiple people had weird experiences that were much more than simple cold spots or seeing things move out of the corner of your eye. But I'm actually going to talk about something different. I was around 14 and lived in a new apartment complex. The buildings towards the back were still being built, and behind them was a big empty lot that had a dirt road you could walk down, and at the end of that was a main road. One night a couple of friends and I were hanging out and ended up walking down that road while we were just talking. On the way back, as we approached one of the unfinished buildings, we heard voices. They sounded male, and thought maybe there were people hanging out inside. But as we got closer, the voices changed into what sounded like a little girl singing a nursery rhyme. I couldn't make out any words, just a sing-song voice. The three of us booked it back to my apartment. Then sometime after that, maybe a couple of months at the most, I was lying in bed to go to sleep, and what sounded like it was outside on the road in front of our place. I heard that exact same voice singing, but still wasn't able to understand the words. I was a bit drowsy, but as soon as I realized what I was hearing, I jolted out of bed and ran to my mom's room. My sister took me out to see Scary Movie 3. She was driving me back home. I was in middle school, while she is older than me and had already moved out of the house. We were joking around the whole car ride back, trying to scare one another and whatnot. For context, the front of my old house had huge glass doors, so you could see into the living room from the street. As we were pulling up to my house, we both were laughing and joking around, but then all of a sudden stopped in unison. She turned to me and said, "Did you see that?" I had goosebumps all over my body after she said that to me, and the hair on my arms stood up. I asked her to tell me what she saw. She described exactly what I had seen, which was a very pale man, with a long brown ponytail, in what looked like to be a long blue coat, almost looked like a Revolutionary War soldier, standing inside our house, looking out to the street through one of the glass doors. At this point we were both freaking out because I told her that's exactly what I had seen too. We decided to take another loop around the neighborhood and pull up to my house again to see if the figure would still be there, which he wasn't. She noted out of there after doping me off. I told my parents what we had seen, and they just laughed and said, "You two are crazy." That house was haunted, and this was one of the many things that I experienced there. I'm glad my family has since moved. My sister felt the same way about the house, and tried to come by as little as possible since it always gave her the creeps. My mom and dad also realized that the house was haunted, but they don't believe in the supernatural, so they tried to dismiss everything as much as they could. A few years ago, I was staying at a cabin that belonged to my ex-wife's uncle at a lake in Maine. There was going to be a family gathering the next day, so we asked her uncle if we could stay the night a bit early, and he agreed. We arrived about midnight, and didn't want to stay in their bed, so we went down the hall and found a room with 2 tiny beds in it. I say tiny because they are still the smallest beds I have ever seen to this day. They must have been smaller than a twin bed. My ex and I both slept on the one closest to the door, and in the morning, she got up and closed the door behind her to go into the rest of the house. At this point, I am awake but just enjoying relaxing and lying in bed with my eyes closed. The sun has now come up and it's pretty bright in the room. I opened my eyes and saw that there were very clean white sheets on these beds, and I was facing the window, away from the door. I rested my eyes again, and shortly after she left, I hear the door open again. Then, she sits at the edge of the bed. The bed was small enough that the weight of her sitting down turned me, so I was now slightly uncomfortable with my face pointing more toward the ceiling. I thought whatever and continued to lay there and rest. After a few minutes, I got the sense that she was staring at me, but I ignored it and enjoyed the feeling of the bed. Then after a little longer, I started wondering why she was just sitting there at the edge of the bed, making me uncomfortable. So, I turned and looked at her, but there was no one there. Suddenly, something got up from the edge of the bed and I felt the weight lift, and my body went back to normal. I was obviously very shocked and just stared at the window, wide awake, very confused. Right as I was pondering what happened, the same thing sat down in the exact same spot, and I felt my body slowly turn with the sinking of the weight on the bed. I was frozen for a bit, just staring with my eyes open, feeling like something was intensely staring at me that I could not see. I very slowly turned my head to the bottom left corner of the bed where it was, and right as soon as I could see the spot, it got up again. I crawled to the door over the pillows instead of going near the foot of the bed and out into the kitchen. I looked back into the room, but it just looked so well lit and normal. I tried telling my ex about what I saw, but she was too scared to hear it. I often think about that day, and I did get a sense that it was either a woman or a child. I didn't get a sense of evil, more a sense of curiosity and caring. That's something that happened to me, that I'm sure happened, that I can never explain. A few years ago, I was staying at a cabin that belonged to my ex-wife's uncle at a lake in Maine. There was going to be a family gathering the next day, so we asked her uncle if we could stay the night a bit early and he agreed. We arrived about midnight, and didn't want to stay in their bed, so we went down the hall and found a room with 2 tiny beds in it. I say tiny because they are still the smallest beds I have ever seen to this day. They must have been smaller than a twin bed. My ex and I both slept on the one closest to the door, and in the morning, she got up and closed the door behind her to go into the rest of the house. At this point, I am awake but just enjoying relaxing and lying in bed with my eyes closed. The sun has now come up and it's pretty bright in the room. I opened my eyes and saw that there were clean white sheets on these beds, and I was facing the window, away from the door. I rested my eyes again and shortly after she left, I hear the door open again. Then, she sits at the edge of the bed. The bed was small enough that the weight of her sitting down turned me, so I was now slightly uncomfortable with my face pointing more toward the ceiling. I thought whatever and continued to lay there and rest. After a few minutes, I got the sense that she was staring at me, but I ignored it and enjoyed the feeling of the bed. Then after a little longer, I started wondering why she was just sitting there at the edge of the bed, making me uncomfortable. So, I turned and looked at her, but there was no one there. Suddenly, something got up from the edge of the bed and I felt the weight lift, and my body went back to normal. I was obviously very shocked and just stared at the window, wide awake, very confused. Right as I was pondering what happened, the same thing sat down in the exact same spot, and I felt my body slowly turn with the sinking of the weight on the bed. I was frozen for a bit, just staring with my eyes open, feeling like something was intensely staring at me that I could not see. I very slowly turned my head to the bottom left corner of the bed where it was, and right as soon as I could see the spot, it got up again. I crawled to the door over the pillows instead of going near the foot of the bed and out into the kitchen. I looked back into the room, but it just looked so well lit and normal. I tried telling my ex about what I saw, but she was too scared to hear it. I often think about that day, and I did get a sense that it was either a woman or a child. I didn't get a sense of evil, more a sense of curiosity and caring. That's something that happened to me, that I'm sure happened, but I can never explain. I grew up in the same house for my entire childhood. My parents built it when I was around 3 or 4, so it's all I remember. When I was a teenager, I began to get really into fashion and clothes, so one Christmas my mom buys me a seamstress mannequin. It was really beautiful and looked fairly new, and it didn't have any creepy vibes to it. Anyway, I put it in the corner of my room so it's facing pretty much everything, about 10 feet away from my bed. Now here's some other relevant information really quick. I have always had a weird feeling in my childhood bedroom even as an adult. As a child I had horrible night terrors and was convinced there was something in my room. This feeling went away when I was around 12 to 13, but I still found myself wary of having my room dark all the way dark till I was like 16. So, one night, I woke up around 2 to 3, I would wake up around this time fairly often so that was nothing new, but I looked to my side to readjust and go back to bed, and the mannequin was right beside my bed next to my pillow. Obviously, I jump out of bed terrified, run to my parents' room to find them sound asleep. I woke them both up asking if they were in my room and they, clearly annoyed I'm waking them up at 3 a.m., said no and went back to bed. I was the only other person in my house. I'm not sure my parents believe me to this day, but this scared me and still confuses me today. My family went to a coliseum to watch horses and their riders perform with a band. When there was a transition between the horses, my cousins and I started chatting. One of them had motioned for us to come closer and she whispered about a woman behind us who had no eyes. I looked behind and a couple rows above ours, and I could see a woman with hollowed eye sockets. I guess she realized we were looking at her because she opened her mouth and slowly turned her head to look towards us. I'm not sure why I didn't register it as creepy, I just accepted it as someone enjoying the show. It took me reading this to realize it might have been paranormal. An older cousin, with better sense, just said it was rude to talk about it and changed the subject. I kept looking back at her and she was still staring at us. The rest of the night was pretty fun though. We have a few CCTVs at my house. My dad was paranoid of people coming into our property, but that's not important. What is important is it's my job to watch them. They sit just at the edge of my vision. Sometimes, and it's always this one camera, there's something moving in the dark. It isn't as immediately frightening as you'd think. We raise goats here, and have a dog too, and they both have access to that yard. But always, /something/off. Goats aren't that small, nor move that quick unless they're running off to be fed, but no one's feeding them at this hour. Speaking of, they don't wander in the dark either. They should all be asleep on the porch. And the dog? Maybe, but I could have sworn I just saw him on the other end of the property. Makes the mind wonder. When I was younger, I was fascinated with supernatural stuff, byproduct of being raised in an extremely religious family. I think I was probably around 13 to 14 at the time. I was camping with my grandparents who had this old motorhome from the 70s which already had a sort of spooky vibe to it. My grandma had bought me a book, can't remember the name, but it was on the history of demons. In the opening pages it talked about how demons try to influence and scare people and how, while they may be interesting, they should never be our sole focus of study when it comes to the supernatural. The book talked about how demons are always on alert trying to look for ways to influence you if you open your mind to them. I remember the book recommended praying for spiritual protection before delving too deep into demonic lore. I also remember thinking that seemed ridiculous, as if demons, if they even existed, would care about me reading some stupid book. Just as I finished telling my grandmother how silly that all seemed, this old-time radio in the motorhome turned on and started scanning through the different radio stations before settling on some old religious guy who was preaching, interestingly enough, on hellfire and brimstone. We both immediately got goosebumps and just stared at each other before she went over and turned the radio off. We spent a lot of years camping in the old motorhome, and that was the only time that something like that happened. I was a freshman in college in 2004, where my high school best friend and I shared a dorm room in a suite that housed four. Our dorm was new, it was built the year before we came to school. A few weeks after we started college, he and I were laying in our respective beds, both of us falling asleep. He may have been asleep at this point. Sleep never came that easily for me. The lights were out. Laptops were closed. We didn't have a TV in our room. The TV was in the communal area outside our room. In 2004, we only had Nokia brick phones, so no one was playing on their phone from bed. Like I said, lights out. Anyway, as I was just drifting off to sleep, right in that twilight phase between consciousness and dreaming, I awoke to what sounded like a loud mix of twisting metal and powerful electric current. It was coming from inside my dorm room, just feet away from within the empty space between the foot of my bed and my roomie's bed. As soon as the noise began, I also heard a voice. At first, I couldn't understand what the voice was saying. Not because it was quiet, it was loud. But the words were unintelligible gobbledygook. Imagine the Tasmanian devil from Looney Tunes just speaking total gibberish, except this voice was truly angry. It sounded malicious. Evil. The voice cut right over the loud metallic/electric sound and reverberated as if it was coming through a large PVC pipe. Eventually, I understood the curse words. The voice and the clanging went on for maybe a total of 10 seconds. Then everything went silent. I laid in bed with the covers over my face for what seemed like forever. Eventually either I or my roomie asked the other if they had heard her voice. We both did. At some point one of us mustered the courage to turn on a light and check out the room. We thought maybe someone had been playing a prank on us. We checked for speakers in our air vents, checked our laptops to see if some pop-up ad had played a sound, and explored other scenarios. We eventually asked the guy in the room next to us if he had heard anything. He was a quiet guy, and we didn't suspect him of prancing us. He hadn't. To this day, I have no idea what that was.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.